Willkommen in einem anderen aufregendes video, or welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 4 of my battle series. This is my second Napoleonic battle, in this case the Battle of Hohenlinden, which occurred on the 3rd of December 1800. As all of my battle series, this is not designed as a historical video. It's designed to assist players in creating scenarios of actual battles. As a result, my emphasis is on the units and what they did in battle rather than any in-depth analysis of why General X did whatever he was supposed to have done or not done. This map shows the situation in late April. The main takeaway here was the bulk of the forces were in Germany, and it was expected that this was the location of the main conflict during the war. As it turned out, that actually was the case. Napoleon surprised the Austrians by driving down into Italy and cutting them off, which is covered in my Battle of Marengo video. In this video, we'll be focusing on what occurred in Germany, which is really the deciding theatre in 1800. This is about the best map I could find, which shows the terrain, which includes both forest and also rough terrain. It was quite difficult to find the rough terrain. This shows some of the intervening hills between the paths of advance, particularly around Essen. Unfortunately, this map is not very clear. It does actually show the deployments of the French and how the Austrians advanced towards the French. This map in Deutsch was the best map showing the lines of advance. It does not show the hills, of which a few were critical in defence. However, most of the hills were in the forest, so this may not be a major impediment in understanding the battlefield. Using all these maps, I created this map, which shows the battlefield about as clearly as I possibly can. The forest does contain rough grounds and steep hills in certain spots. As I lacked sufficient detail, I did not include it here, but as I indicated before, the rough terrain and forest is kind of all together, so it doesn't actually add any additional impediments that you can't see here. It's just the type of impediments are a little bit different to what you see here. The French had to wait until probably about 1805 before they created a formal corps system, but they did call their ad hoc corps equivalent formations corps. The French divided their army into three parts: left, right, and reserves. For want of a better words, these can all be considered as corps. The French army's three corps are shown here. Each of the corps consists of between 3 and 4 divisions each. The last corps-size formation that you see here, with its 3 divisions, was not involved in the battle, and I must assume this was far further to the south, or to the left of the screen, or even possibly in the rear in case the defence was not successful. The Austrians did not even call their ad hoc corps formations corps, but they did adopt the very old-fashioned column system. There were 4 corps-size formations involved in this battle, and actually one interesting thing is when you actually see the deployment, you realise why they're called columns, because as they're advancing towards the battle, they all form a column each. This shows the 4 columns or corps-size formations, each of which consists of 2 divisions, and 1, which is the main army, consisting of 3 infantry division and 1 cavalry division. Due to mistakes, one corps-size formation never really got into combat, and another was so badly commanded as to be ineffective. Confident after their victory over the surprised French at Ampfing, the Austrians continued on the offensive, only to find a key town, Hague, abandoned by the French. Now convinced the French would continue to fall back to the west, the Austrians decided to aggressively continue the pursuit. To speed up his forces' movement, the Austrians split their army into 4 columns that would take 4 separate routes to arrive at the crossroad town of Hohenlinden and continue the pursuit from there. 2 columns would march west along separate roads, while a column would take a northerly route and a column would take a southerly route. All 4 columns were ordered to aggressively attack any French resistance they encountered, as it was believed to only be a rear guard. This was a critical error on the Austrians' part. Little did the Austrians know the French had decided to make a stand at Hohenlinden. While the French had initially planned an offensive, the surprise of the Austrian offensive caused them to reconsider. Having detected the Austrians, the French decided to form a defensive line around Hohenlinden and hold the centre and left while attacking on their right. General Richepen's division was given command of the attack on the right flank, supported by General Decan division. The critical right-wing attack consisted of 2 divisions as a result, while the remaining 4 infantry divisions, supported by a cavalry division, would hold the defensive line. All the Austrian column started at dawn. Marching on the all-weather highway, Colleret's column made very good time despite heavy snow. At 7 a.m, his advance guard collided with the 108th Line Infantry demi-brigade of Grouchy's division. Defending deep in the forest, the 108th held their ground at first. However, the Austrians sent a grenadier battalion in a flank attack and drove the French back. Colleret's committed the Bavarian Brigade and a second Grenadier Battalion to keep the attack rolling. As the Austrians burst from the tree line, Grouchy's led a powerful infantry and cavalry counterattack. Colleret's troops reeled back as the 11th Chasseurs Cheval Regiment broke a square of grenadiers, and the 4th Hussar Regiment overran an artillery battery. Having lost 5 cannon, Colleret's decided to suspend the drive until Latour and Riche came up on his flanks. Anxious about his open left flank, he sent 2 grenadier battalions back in search of Riche's column. To the north, Quinmenar's column flushed French outposts from Issen. Schwarzenberg, who led Quinmenar's left division, pushed southwest to crash into the division of Bastoul and Ney, or Ney in English. An Austrian force captured the town of Forsten, but Moreau, the French commander-in-chief, committed the reserve cavalry to help drive them out. A back-and-forth struggle began between the 2 forces along pretty much the entire line. On the far north flanks, Quinmeillar's right division began coming into action against Legard's division. Both sides were now fully engaged, 5 Austrian infantry divisions against 4 French infantry divisions, with 1 cavalry division on each side. The Austrian column under the command of Latour, moving along muddy forest trails and among snow and sleet squalls, fell badly behind schedule. At 10 a.m, his column was still well to the rear of Colleret's corps. By this time, the gunfire from Quinmeillar and Colleret's combats could clearly be heard to the front on either side. Even more disturbing were sounds of battle from way down the south. Latour made the extraordinary decision to divide his divisions into small task forces. He sent 1 infantry battalion and 6 cavalry squadrons to the north to look for Quinmeillar. 1 battalion and 4 squadrons marched south to find Colleret's, and he sent 2 battalions and 2 squadrons to assist Schwarzenberg's attack, and 3 battalions and an artillery battery to help Colleret's attack. This left him with only 3 battalions and 6 squadrons. This decision was a disaster, as it basically broke up his force into basically groups that were too small to really influence much of the battle. Like Latour's column, Riche's column further south had to contend with terrible roads and snow squalls. They fell far behind Colleret, reaching Apaching only at 9:30 a.m. Consequently, the French division under Richepens passed in front of Riche's column. Near the village of St. Christopher, the 2 Austrian grenadier battalions sent by Colleret's to find Riche stumbled across Richepens' marching column, cutting his division in half. With single-minded determination, the Frenchman left his rear brigade under General of Brigade Jean-Baptiste Dorc to fight it out and drove to the north with his leading brigade. With the 8th Line Demi-Brigade and 1st Chasseurs Cheval leading, Richepens seized the village of Maidenbeth and advanced to the main highway. There he confronted elements of the Austrian cavalry division. Leaving his 2 advanced units to bear the brunt of the Austrian cuirassier charge, Recompense wheeled the 48th Line demi-brigade west onto the highway. Aware that this route took him directly into Colleret's rear area, he formed the demi-brigade's 3 battalions side by side with skirmishers protecting the flanks. Hearing firing to the east, the Austrians sent 3 Bavarian battalions from Colleret's column to investigate. These units moved to the southeast and became embroiled in the fight with the French. 2 more Bavarian battalions now appeared and blocked Recompense's path. After a brief fight, the 48th Line overwhelmed the Bavarians. Riche's patrols told him that 2 French divisions were in the area. However, instead of pushing into combat raging to his front, he cautiously decided to wait for his stragglers to arrive. He then divided his divisions into 5 small columns, none of which were powerful enough to affect the battle in any meaningful way, and he sent forward each of them on separate forest trails. Riche held back 3 battalions and most of his cavalry as a reserve. This was another critical error that the Austrians had made. At 11 a.m, Decane's division came up in support of Recompense's division. The situation was very fluid, with units blundering into each other in a heavy snowfall. The French infusion of French troops finally broke through the opposition. Spearheaded by the Polish Danube Legion, Decane turned east to grapple with Riche. Decane's men overcame Riche's individual columns one by one and pushed them back to the heights of Albakin. The Austrians managed to hold on top of this hill-type position and actually captured 500 French soldiers while suffering only 900 casualties. But for all intents and purposes, Riche's entire column or corps was out of the battle. Sensing victory, Moreau, the French commander-in-chief, ordered Grenadier's divisions and Grouchy's divisions to attack around noon. I'm not quite sure how he sensed it, but anyway, spider sense perhaps. Undeterred by Latour's weak pressure on his front, primarily because he was attacking, or actually barely attacking, with small detachments that really had no chance of actually achieving anything, Ney swung to his right and began pounding Colleret's troops. Pressing his attack, he overran their position, capturing about 1,000 soldiers and 10 cannons. Grouchy also returned to the offensive, driving forward. Hemmed in on 3 sides by Ney, Grouchy and Recompense, Colleret's column finally disintegrated in a disorderly rout. Archduke John escaped capture on a fast horse, but many of his men were not so lucky, and thousands of demoralised Austrians and Bavarians surrendered. In addition, over 60 artillery pieces fell into French hands. In the Austrian centre, when Latour learned of the left centre's column fate, when its fugitives started flooding the nearby woods, he decided to abandon his position and retreat to Essen, leaving Kienmeyer to fend for himself on his right. When Kienmeyer got news of Colleret's destruction, he ordered his division's commanders to fall back. On the Austrian right flank, after a brief fight against Legrand, Archduke Ferdinand pulled back with his Dragoon Brigade covering his withdrawal. Legarde reported fewer than 300 casualties while rounding up 500 prisoners and 3 guns, so half of this corps managed to extract itself fairly painlessly. Unfortunately, Schwarzenberg was not in such a favourable position, being involved far heavier into combat. However, thanks to Schwarzenberg's able combat leadership, his division escaped this tight spot. At one point, a French officer came forward under a flag of truce to demand his surrender, but the Austrian managed to successfully disengage his command and brought them back safely that evening without the loss of a single cannon. Probably this was the high point of the Austrian effort, and Schwarzenberg certainly did prove his ability at leadership. The Austrian reported losses of 798 killed, 3,687 wounded, and 7,195 prisoners, with 50 cannons and 85 artillery caissons captured. Bavarian casualties numbered only 24 killed and 90 wounded, but their losses also included 1,754 prisoners, 26 artillery pieces, and 36 caissons. In round numbers, this amounts to 4,600 killed and wounded, plus 8,950 soldiers and 76 guns captured. The French admitted casualties of 1,839 soldiers, 1 cannon and 2 caissons. Since several units failed to return in reports, Moreau's army probably lost at least 3,000 men. This was a significant victory for the French. While this battle is normally overlooked because Napoleon was not involved, it was nonetheless a very interesting battle, with some commanders displaying extraordinary skill, especially Richepince on the French side, who made the critical decision which won the battle for the French. In terms of overall strategy, there was nothing really fantastic about this battle. If the Austrians had advanced in a more coordinated manner, the flank attack by the French would have been quickly stopped. But due to errors on the Austrian side and no errors on the French won. Now the first step is to look at the forces involved in a manner which is useful to a wargamer. On the French side, starting with the left wing, which consists of 3 divisions, the French in this period used demi-brigades instead of regiments, but for all intents and purposes they were regiments consisting of 3 battalions. The cavalry regiments were not large compared with the latter period in the war, but there was a reasonable number of regiments. Artillery was not very common. However, in this period a lot of artillery was embedded into battalions and thus is not shown here. The next column, which was the reserve column, consisted of the bulk of the French forces directly under the command of the CNC. It consisted of 3 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division. The cavalry division was held in reserve, while 1 division held the front line along with the 3 divisions already covered in the previous image. 2 divisions of this force consisted of the critical French right outflanking attack, or French right attack. The final corps, which was on the right flank, was not directly involved in the battle. I have to assume it was positioned somewhere to the right of the French position and off the playing area. The fact the French were able to win with a third of their forces not directly involved was rather impressive. Going to the Austrian right column consisted of 2 divisions, one of which was commanded by the only Austrian commander to distinguish himself in the battle. 1 division was not heavily involved in the battle, taking up a position well to the north of the map. The Austrian forces were really divided by poor terrain. The next column, or corps, the centre-right column, was being heavily delayed by the poor conditions of the road and weather, and was, as a result, almost not involved at all in the battle. It consisted of 2 divisions. Leadership was, to put it mildly, poor, as this corps split itself up into small, almost useless detachment, which had really very little effect on the battle, only to run back to reconcentrate once the battle had been lost and run away. The bulk of the army, and where the commander-in-chief was located, was in the left centre corps. This consisted of 3 infantry divisions and a cavalry division. It performed reasonably well, but after being held back at its front, attacked in the rear and finally attacked on its right flank, it simply collapsed, and its rout spelled the defeat of the Austrian army. Strangely enough, the Bavarian battalions didn't seem to perform very well. I do know that in memoirs the Bavarians claimed this was due to the commander, but I don't know. I suspect that the Bavarians possibly didn't have their heart into this battle, but whatever it was, the Bavarians were defeated several times with inferior French forces. The final corps, which was the Austrian left corps, also suffered from very poor roads and took a very long time to move up to a position. And this delay was basically blamed for the disaster. However, I suspect the major cause was the failure of the right centre corps to get involved in any meaningful manner. It also didn't help that 2 of the corps decided to break itself up into little packets or detachments, which basically had minimal effect on the battle. In this case, the corps was made up of 2 divisions, which seemed to be a standard structure for a Austrian corps, I suppose. In my previous videos, I normally start describing the force mix required to duplicate this battle, but players can really do that themselves using the information I've already provided. The only significant guide I can provide is the scale required to duplicate this battle. At over 40,000 men per side, each figure needs to represent at least 200 men, otherwise the force mix will simply be too large to complete in a single day. Even at this scale, we're talking about almost 100 elements per side, which let's say only 75 per side were heavily involved in the battle, is still a very large force mix and battle that would probably take an entire day to play, if not two. My preference would be to set the rules at a scale of, let's say, 250 to 1 for infantry, which means that that's 1,000 men per element, and 200 to 1 for cavalry, which basically means that it's 400 cavalry per element, and probably 1 to 20 cannon scale. If not even double these scales if you want to get the element count down to give you a very small and playable game. The ground scale is probably the most significant issue, and it would need to be at least 1 in 10,000 to get the entire battlefield into a reasonably sized playing area. The playing area I normally use is 3 by 4 feet. Now obviously if you can deploy a double size playing area, 6 by 8, then you could go to 1 to 5,000 scale. But you can imagine at 1 to 5,000 there are few rules that actually allow you to game even at that scale. So and that requires a very large playing area and a lot of units and a lot of time. In most cases it's 1 10,000. That's my strong recommendation. This map is rather interesting. It does show a fairly detailed breakdown of the French deployment and even some of the Austrian forces. However, I doubt its accuracy because I don't see the Austrian corps at Albatching. So, I suspect that it's maybe a scenario or it's not accurate or something of that nature. But nonetheless, interesting to view. The option that I'm increasingly adopting for the recreation of historical battles is to use a figure game conversion of the SPI Napoleonic Squad and Folio games. This allows for variable unit scales, which for this battle I have adopted 1,000 infantry per infantry element and 500 cavalry per cavalry element, or a roundabout. The scenario document that I have posted provides the original TO&E, so players can change the scale to whatever they prefer. The playing area shown here is optimally a 3 by foot playing area. This does require some custom terrain creation. However, for my initial games, or my test games, I simply use felt to represent the rivers, roads and woods, and my standard 4 cm square built-up area terrain features. The ground scale, in this case, is 1 in 10,000. Incidentally, what you see here is the template that I use to create my figure gaming playing area. All this is posted in my website, which provides or my IO group, Kriegsspiel IO group, which contains all the SPI conversion scenario information for those interested. This shows the deployment, with the elements clearly visible as long as you have good eyes or glasses. The commanders are not displayed. Players simply place commanders as they see fit. The scenario is hard to get working correctly and requires lots of special rules to slow down the 2 rear columns and prevent the main column closest to the French from retreating. As an optional rule, if they do retreat, the remaining French corps arrives as reinforcements. But regardless, in my playtests, it's pretty hard to actually get the same result of the real battle because, quite frankly, the Austrians can see everything and they're not, obscure. One of the issues with having a bird's eye view. But nonetheless, it makes for an interesting scenario because the Austrians are in a fairly poor position here. The reason why I tended to move to converting a board game to figure gaming is board games pretty much have as their number one objective reproducing a historical battle, and number two, having something that's playable. Most figure gaming rules do not really lend themselves to reproducing a historical battle either accurately or in a playable form, as lots of Napoleonic battles really consisted of the movement into battle, which is pretty hard to do based on the common scales that figure gaming normally adopts. You need a scale of at least 1 in 5,000 for small battles such as Marengo, or 1 in 10,000 for medium-sized battles such as this, in order to really reflect this effect. The really large battles tend to just involve higher unit densities, so I rarely need to go beyond 1 in 10,000 ground scale, but I do need to change the figure scale in that case, going for, let's say, 1 in 4,000 for Leipzig, to give you an example. Other options are the use of a big base set of rules, such as Bloody Big Battle for Napoleonics. This has a pretty strong focus on historical or duplicating historical battles. There are smaller scale rules which cover history rather well, such as the Age of Eagles, but based on the scale, the games end up being too large for most players. But if you have the time, space and figures, that is actually probably the best choice, if you want to get to that scale. Many other good sets of rules fit in this category, but they do the job, but they still require too large a playing area. The scales are simply wrong, and it's impossible to simulate the manoeuvring before the battle in any meaningful way. For some battles this is not an issue, such as Austerlitz, but for Verdun it becomes pretty much an issue and does affect the actual battle a great deal. Rules such as DBN are really fun rules, and I highly recommend it, but they're not really focused to duplicate historical battles. Absolute Emperor may be a slightly better fit, but even here, the historical battle is pretty abstract. It's really focused on playability, just like DBM is. Rules such as Blücher can be used, but they're also very focused on playability rather than duplicating an actual historical battle in all its detail and glory. But nonetheless, you can use Blücher, it's just you get rather odd results, etc. And so we come to a close to this video. This completes my video on this subject. I'll leave it up to an enthusiastic gamer to create a scenario from the material I've got here using whatever rules they wish. If you wish to use a set of rules which has a scale of 1 in 250 per figure, then I would recommend going to my IO Group's Kriegsspiel site, the URL visible here and also in the description, downloading that scenario, and it will provide you with all the elements and the battle map that you would probably require in order to duplicate it. You could even try using the SPI converted set of rules as well. So, denken Sie daran, immer für Hill, heimatland zu kämpfen.